My name is Amira Sonbol. I'm a professor of history at Georgetown University, and I'm a department chair, that is faculty chair. And this is our last session. I wanted to take this as an opportunity to thank Harry and to thank Anatol for putting this wonderful conference together. I want to also thank our assistant, Hagar Racha, without whom nothing happens. These are the real forces behind putting these meetings together. We have a wonderful panel for you today. I'm going to give each one of you 15 minutes exactly, and then I will let you know when you have about 3 minutes left. Is that good? Rather than disturb you as you talk, 3 minutes to go, and then cut you off. Guillotine style, right on time, so we can have more time for discussion, because the discussion period is usually the most interesting. Okay, great. Our panel today is called Religion, Nationalism, and Conflict. And we will begin with William Reno from Northwestern University, whose paper's title is The Somali Model of Development. Would you like to take the podium or speak from here? You have the choice. Okay, great.
Okay, very good. So I have pictures for you. Hopefully that'll keep your attention as well. So I get the category of models, I guess that would fall under the heading of failed states. So if we're looking at the Indian Ocean world, this is the area that I love so much because the politics is so complicated and multi-layered. So as a social scientist, Somalia is a great place to work, although recently I've been working in Iraq. And a lot of times Iraqis don't like to hear that I learn a lot about how to study Iraq from my work in Somalia, but I do think Somalia is relevant to look at as a model of development. So hopefully it fits in very well with the overall agenda of this project, looking at the diversity of trajectories in the Indian Ocean basin. There we go. So just for little background pictures, I would start off with the aspirational Somalia, and this I sort of call imaginary modernism, and this would be scientific democratization, which suffers, I believe, from an excess of formalism. But nonetheless, this is the major narrative for readers of the newspaper that one would encounter when talking about Somalia. So sort of like scientific democratization in general, we have stages of progress. The stages of progress encounter contradictions at critical points, which are then resolved by a synthesis. So the story in this version would go with late 2011, the AMISOM Multilateral African Union Peacekeeping Force kicks Shabaab out of the capital city, and now the capital city is safe for the new model. February 2012, there's a major conference that's held in London. The stakeholders are gathered together. The spoilers are warned that now there's international attention to the problem of Somalia, to begin the process of building state institutions. And step by step, this prescribes electing a legislature. A date for an election is set. There are all sorts of initiatives to try to craft a human rights program, other sorts of reforms that are supposed to go into the process of writing a new constitution. This will provide a blueprint for a new order, new political order. There'll be presidential elections. The UN partial embargo on transfers of arms will be lifted so that a new Somali army can be built. And oftentimes I would read dispatches. Nicholas K., special representative to the Secretary General, indicating very much that he was sort of dizzy with success, saying that this was an indigenous process and that one of the things that makes this whole process so successful is the fact that there's significant Somali ownership. Now, part of the problem with this model of development, sort of what I would call the imaginary or aspirational Somalia, is that it's based upon two assumptions, I think neither of which are fulfilled. And the first one is a political assumption, and it's an assumption that the government of Somalia has both the political will and the capacity to engage its own population. So that through the expansion of social services, the provision of more legitimate governance, that this is something that Somali people will buy into. And then the second assumption, which I believe is also false, is that Somalia has an armed force that's able to protect that government. And I think these are two essential deficiencies in terms of the program. So I would contrast that with what I would call sort of the desert of the real, and this is partly informed by my experiences working in Mogadishu and other places. And starting in 2011, this is a different trajectory. So at the beginning, there is a modicum of stability, I suppose, in the capital city. But when we look at the period since 2011, we see actually, I would argue, a decline in security in even the capital city. And that should be something that would be rather alarming to the reader of dispatches and newspaper and the web. And that is, after so much time, why is the government unable to even control the streets of its own capital city, or at least to provide enough security that a foreign visitor could maybe walk down the main boulevard, something that I would not advise a foreigner to do at this time. But looking at the security situation in more detail, what one finds is a series of hotel bombings. It's significant that bombings happen at hotels. It's not that the bombers are hostile to hospitality, but rather that this gives you, it's a sort of preliminary indicator of how politics actually works in the capital city and more widely. Because what one finds is that the targets are not just hotels per se, but rather sort of the warlord proprietors who run a lot of these hotels and the legislators who take refuge in these hotels, a lot of them quite heavily fortified. And one sees within this a whole political economy of that first image of Somali development, and that is legislators who receive United Nations stipends, and part of those stipends used to pay the hotel bills, and how that gets recycled then into sort of this parallel political economy of governance. Also in this image is, I think, a fair degree of success on the part of elements of the Shabab in attacking Amisom bases, some of which have been overrun. The Kenyan government, in one notable example, unwilling to publish casualty statistics, maybe perhaps 150 Kenyan soldiers killed, but also Burundi and Ethiopian bases attacked. Again, this is the type of activity that, in order for that to take place, indicates that something very different is going on, a level of organization, a capacity to operate in areas that are supposedly under government control. Also a record of corruption. I've visited the Central Bank of Somalia. There are not very many people there. It's kind of a quiet place, and one wonders whether the people sitting there are innumerate. But that's, the point is, that's not really where the financial heart of the government is. It's found in other places, but because it doesn't conform to this particular model, you see reports, World Bank expert reporting that, quote, 88% Somali government expenditures go in irregular and unrecorded directions. It might as well be 100%, but that's because it operates in a different kind of system in that, I mean, to use Alex DeWall's formulation, it's a political marketplace, that this money has to circulate through personalist networks rather than sort of in a more conventional fashion. And then a third factor that I think is important in this sort of desert of the real, and that is the problem of infiltration. I think intellectually, infiltration is very interesting because, and I think it's most important, at least in my mind, because it points to particular problems for this sort of Western-sponsored model of democratization. And what's happening is that individuals and groups in this context have to play all sides. You know, they have to hedge their bets. So one of the frustrations for foreigners is that the people that they're supposed to be cooperating with seem to be double dealing all of the time. So the foreigners fall into this pattern. It's sort of the seduction of moral repugnance. You know, they're like, oh, the Somalis can't do anything. And in one instance, I was speaking to a deputy minister of defense, and he was complaining that his boss was not allowed by Bancroft Corporation access to Somali military facilities. I said, why is this? He said, because they don't trust him. They think that he will give information to Al-Shabaab or something like that. And I say, well, but of course, I mean, any reasonable family, you want to have one in Shabaab, and you want to have one in the government, and you want to have one in an NGO, and hopefully in an international organization. I mean, this is a great way to hedge bets. It's a terrible way to keep information, though. And I think that what this does is, and I can develop this in a paper we'll talk about, I guess, in the workshop, is the political economy of this process of state failure, of state collapse. Because in a nutshell, the argument I make is that it creates a big, huge problem for collective action. I mean, one explanation for this type of behavior is, you know, people will say, oh, well, it's a pastoralist society and people have clans and all of these sorts of things. So it's sort of a reversion to the past. I mean, clan politics is a cultural inflection for a problem that I think is very contemporary. And I think that this problem is related to something that's much more recent. I think it's a legacy of authoritarian governance in the period before the collapse of the state, and in particular, wait a minute, how do I get to the other PowerPoint? Okay, there we go. All right, so this is the Desert of the Real. This is not Somalia, but this is South Sudan. This is for a different project. You know, one image, you've got the Sudan People's Liberation Army. You have a single army. That's the focus of that model of state building of the international community. This is what the SPLA in South Sudan really is. These are the different militias that make it up. See, this is the problem of collective action. Because, you know, no matter what my cultural inflection is, if I'm caught in this type of dynamic, I'm going to play all sides as well. But when we look at the origin of this, where this comes from is a strategy of control of the pre-conflict government. So it's a government that learns how to use this anthropology of local level tension, sort of a strategy of creative tension, types of oppositions between people that in most societies would be purely private. So these are very weak states in institutional sense, but they're very totalizing, and this is what was happening in the 1980s, I think, in Somalia, as the Siad Barre regime became very adept. You could say the same thing about Gaddafi. They're like anthropologists, down to the level of the family in a lot of cases. So what they do is they pit people against each other. The process of economic liberalization becomes an additional tool to do this, because then you've got more resources to distribute, that you can shift sides, which side to support, which side to to disfavor. And what this does is it creates a disaster. It's, I think, a model of de-development. And part of the reason why I work in Iraq is my surprise and my shock, because I had thought of this as a sub-Saharan phenomenon, originally working in Liberia and Sierra Leone and then moving to places like Somalia. But I think this is very serious. This is a crisis of modernism. It's a crisis of the high modernist state. And what is surprising is in a milieu such as this region, that there actually are rulers who burn down their own states, a strategy of regime survival. And so in that sense, I think Somalia is a very important model to look at because I think it has lessons for other parts of the world. And it's not just an African sub-Saharan problem, but I think that at least on the edges of an international state system, it's partially a systemic problem. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much. You may want to include Yemen. As, our next presenter is Michael Woldemariam from Boston University, and the title of his talk is State Building After the Split, Partition and Governance in the Horn of Africa.
Great. So I'd like to just very quickly begin, like some others that have spoken before me, just in thanking Harry and Anatol for the invitation, and also thanking the presenters. I think the great thing about coming to a conference on the Indian Ocean world is you get to hear about regions that you know very embarrassingly little about, and I've learned quite a bit over the last 2 days. So let me jump right into it. So conceptually, I'm very interested in the issue of partition and understanding the kinds of states and political orders that emerge out of moments of partition or processes of partition. And the argument I'll make, just to put it up front, although I've been told this is blue sky thinking, and this argument may be terribly wrong, but I hope it's right, is that you really can't understand the emergence of these political orders without examining the relationship between newly partitioned states. And I'll talk more specifically, just to make this to map this onto a particular case, I'll talk about Eritrea and Ethiopia. And I don't think you can understand the emergence of resilient, robust authoritarian orders in both of these countries in the post-1991 period without understanding the relationship between these two countries that were split in 1991. So, there we go. So the concept of partition is somewhat slippery. There's a large literature on the issue of partition in political science. It's not clear. I mean, people use different definitions. Just for my purposes here, just to get this out of the way, I take the broadest possible definition. So I'm talking about the division of a sovereign state into new sort of functionally sovereign political units. And it often involves, it's usually a big deal, right? It involves a reconfiguration of social and political identities, involves a restructuring oftentimes of economic systems, of political systems, right? So it's significant, it's often foundational to the states that emerge out of this process. So in the Horn, I don't have to tell many of you that know about the region, partition is a very important issue. I mean, you cannot understand the contemporary Horn of Africa without understanding partition. In the same way that you can't really understand contemporary South Asia without understanding partition. I think there are real parallels here. Real parallels between the Eritrea-Ethiopia case and India-Pakistan, which I may talk about if I have time. So there are three major states in the region, apologies to Djibouti, that went through partitions in the post-Cold War era. Eritrea, Ethiopia in 1991, well, de facto 1991, officially in 1993. Of course, Sudan, right? South Sudan became independent in 2011. And Somaliland in 1991, although that was, of course, a different case because that partition did not yield internationally recognized state. It yielded effectively a de facto state. Right? And I think, just to put this in some comparative perspective, I think the prevalence of partition in the Horn is quite unique in the African context for a number of reasons. I mean, this was... So off the bat, I think we have to recognize this was the one part of the continent where the norm regarding the sanctity of colonial borders, which I think Harry mentioned earlier, was largely ignored in the construction of post-colonial states in the region. This is something that was quite unique, I think, to the Horn. And there were a couple of different reasons for this. Let me mention two very briefly. Part of the issue was that you had an indigenous African power that was not a creation of colonialism. And I refer here, of course, to Ethiopia. A lot of people don't realize it, but in the critical period of African decolonization, the 1950s and 1960s, Ethiopia laid claim to Eritrea, which would of course be federated with in 1952 and officially annexed in 1962. But it also laid claim to French Somaliland, Djibouti, and even Somaliland, right? It made very affirmative claims that these were integral parts of historic Ethiopia at the UN and through other international institutions in the 1950s and 1960s. And so my friend Awit Woldemariam, who wrote a great comparative study of the Eritrean Revolution, East Timor, the East Timorese Revolution, talks about Ethiopia practicing a particular brand of what he called third world colonialism. Right? Some real parallels here, I think, with Morocco and Western Sahara, but that's another story. The other issue, of course, was that you had real acute Cold War pressures in the Horn of Africa in particular. This was a particularly relevant arena within the African context for the Cold War. And so the United States basically engineered, and Eritreans will always remind you of this to this day, basically engineered at the United Nations the federation of Eritrea and Ethiopia, because Emperor Haile Selassie was a key ally of the United States in the context of the Cold War, engineered the federation. And then when Haile Selassie basically abrogated a UN resolution and formally annexed Eritrea as Ethiopia's 14th province in 1962, the United States basically swept this under the rug at the UN, right? So Cold War politics mattered quite a bit. So this history sets the stage for secessionist movements throughout the region that would be quite successful because you had clear regional identities anchored in somewhat persuasive legal and normative arguments about colonial boundaries. Right? Now, when you put these partitions in comparative perspective, what is interesting, of course, for me is that they yielded different kinds of state-building projects. Not just in the new states that were forged, Eritrea, South Sudan, Somaliland, but in the sort of old rump states that they left behind, right? Partition was transformative for those units as well, for Ethiopia, for Sudan, and Somalia. And I think the existing literature on partition doesn't give you much leverage in understanding these differences. It's really preoccupied with these kind of absolutist debates about, whether partition is good or not. Right? Does it reduce violence? Does it promote democracy? If you've ever read the Journal of International Security, there's like this recurring debate every 10 years about whether partition is a good idea. It's usually cued by or provoked by some ongoing civil war where we sort of think we need to carve a society up in order to resolve that conflict. So what were these different state-building projects, right? Given that the literature doesn't give us much perspective on this, let me just map out the different political projects and provide an explanation. And I'm particularly interested in the strength of the state and sort of where it sits in this sort of, to put it crudely, this sort of liberal to a liberal continuum. Although I think we've learned from previous presentations that those categories are a bit problematic. Well, in Eritrea and Ethiopia, partition gave way to a fairly robust party states that were very authoritarian and dominated the social, political, and economic landscapes of these two countries. Now, there are big differences between Eritrea and Ethiopia, obviously. The Eritrean state exerts a level of social control over its citizens that really has no parallel in Ethiopia. And frankly, I don't think has any parallel anywhere else in Africa. I can talk more about that later. In Sudan, partition gave way to, at least in Sudan, I'm talking about in Khartoum here, partition gave way to increasingly beleaguered political establishment that faced continuing challenges from the Sudanese periphery, but also at the political center in urban areas. Now, the NCP has obviously survived these challenges, but partition has really put ruling elites on the back foot and accentuated a kind of reformist streak that I think you've seen since the early 2000s. I think Harry has written quite a bit about this as well. In South Sudan, you had a civil war, right? Although that happened 2 years after formal partition. So the SPLM collapsed into this sort of devastating ethnic ethnic-based civil war. In Somalia, the departure of Somaliland really, I think, accelerated the disintegration of the political center in Mogadishu. So we know sort of how that story went, and Will has spoken a bit about it. In Somaliland, we sometimes forget that not long after independence was announced in 1991, the Somali national movement, the vehicle of Somaliland independence, basically imploded along clan lines, plunging the country into a sustained period of factionalized militia warfare. Now, over the long term, through the administration of Mohammed Igal, Somaliland was put back together. There was a transition in which Somaliland emerged as the only real democratic order in the Horn of Africa. Although at the same time, I would say the state in Somaliland is a minimalist state. It certainly lacks the kind of state strength that you see in the Ethiopian or Eritrean context. So let me focus again more narrowly on Eritrea and Ethiopia, because these were partitions that produced fairly strong states and very robust liberal regimes. So most people that know something about Eritrea and Ethiopia would say what made Eritrea and Ethiopia different in the post-partition moment was the fact that both countries were led by newly installed liberation movements, liberation armies that were extraordinarily disciplined, efficient, highly ideologized, and carried some level of popular legitimacy, although that's certainly contestable in the Ethiopian context. And these were movements that had succeeded against tremendous odds against the Soviet, the Derg, the Soviet-backed regime, fought from 1975 onwards against a very robust military. And they succeeded. And so, Terence Lyons, I think, has written very persuasively about how the capacities that the TPLF in Ethiopia and the EPLF in Eritrea built during the struggle against the Derg, how those were then transferred in the post-liberation movement and used for the purposes of authoritarian consolidation. I think there's a persuasive case to be made there. There's also an argument about sort of the unique cultural heritage of the Orthodox highlands in Eritrea and Ethiopia. And for better or for worse, although neither government would admit this, the Orthodox highlands are the political center of gravity in both Eritrea and Ethiopia. You can't ignore that fact. And social organization in this part of Ethiopia and Eritrea is based on hierarchy, social conformity, and a high degree of deference to state authority, right? And you can really see this when sort of reading Eritrean and Ethiopian proverbs about the state and political power. Different story, though. Now, I think the problem with these approaches, I think they have some relevance, some resonance, but I think the problem is they really understate the seriousness of the challenges that the TPLF and the EPLF faced to their political monopoly when they came to power in 1991 in partitioned Ethiopia, right? Now, Ethiopia we know about. Ethiopia faced a number of rival ethnically based rebel movements that challenged their authority. In Eritrea, there's this narrative that at independence, or when the Derg was defeated, the EPLF, this was the victorious nationalist movement, swept into Eritrean cities, and the people embraced them with open arms, right? And that's a very stylized narrative, thank you. But what it ignores is that the Eritrean nationalist struggle was fought along sectarian lines. There was a huge split in the Eritrean nationalist movement for much of its duration. Right, so there was a real potential, I think, for rivals to emerge to the EPLF. So I think there are three very quick assumptions that I want to make here that are true in many post-partition contexts, but are really important to understanding the Eritrean Ethiopian cases. And so let me just list them very close. I have 3 minutes, right? 2 minutes. Yeah. 2 minutes, so I'll wrap it up very quickly. Let me skip those assumptions and let me just give you my argument. And that would be, I think, when President Isaias Afwerki, the leader of the nationalist movement in Eritrea, and Meles Zenawi, longtime Prime Minister of Ethiopia, died in 2013. These were the critical actors that partitioned Eritrea and Ethiopia. When they agreed to the partition of Ethiopia and the independence of Eritrea as heads of these newly victorious insurgent movements in '91, part of that consensus was an informal agreement that the EPLF would use every tool at its disposal to prop up the TPLF in Ethiopia. And the TPLF in Ethiopia would do the same for the EPLF in Eritrea. So there was an elite bargain about propping up the authoritarian project of each rebel movement in each country, right? And so at this really critical juncture in their history, in the early and mid-1990s, it was this external support in the political, economic, and military domains from the state they had just separated from that allowed the EPLF and the TPLF to become the robust, dominant, authoritarian regimes that they now are, right? I mean, obviously we could quibble, given the ongoing protests in Ethiopia today, with that assessment, but it's been around for 25 years, right? And maybe in Q&A I can cite the sort of particular evidence, and I've written about this before, that to sort of motivate this argument. But placed in comparative perspective, I think we could say the following. There was no such arrangement between Somalia and Somaliland, obviously, because there was no consensus on the partition of Somalia. Right? There was no political center in Mogadishu, and even if there was, no one was going to accept the independence of Somaliland. I think there was a similar arrangement between the SPLM and the NCP. But that bargain, elite bargain, fell apart very quickly after independence because of a BA, because of negotiations over access to oil, for a whole variety of reasons. And so more generally, I think my argument suggests that we really need to think about, particularly in the context of partition, elite bargains, cross-border bargains, and their connection to authoritarian state building. But that's just not, I mean, we could move beyond context of partition as well and just think about authoritarian state building in the Horn more generally, right? And think about these cross-border bargains. So I'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, our third presentation is by James Onley from Qatar University and Exeter University. And the title of his presentation is Arab Nationalism in the Arab Gulf, the Origins and Significance of the Name Game.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to Harry for inviting me to be here. It's great to be back. I thought because of the complexity of my argument in this paper, I would partly read and then partly talk, because I don't want to miss anything out. It's a very tightly argued paper. So before the dawn of, could we have the, right, slide one, good. Before the dawn of the oil era and the rise of rival nationalisms in Arabia and Iran in the 1950s and 60s, the Gulf was a transnational space in which the cultures of Arabia, Iran, Baluchistan, India, and Africa overlapped and intermingled in a hybrid form of culture known as Khaliji in Arabia and Bandari in Iran. Slide 2, please. Or can I do that myself?
You have this thing.
Oh, I do. Ah. Nope.
Oh, don't ask me.
How did I? Okay. How do I get rid of that?
We have a technician here. Somebody can find him.
How do I get rid of that? Sorry. Oh, I see. Okay, maybe I just do.
I pointed out the wrong one. He showed me this one.
Yeah, the one on the right.
The one on the right.
Not this one.
No, that one.
That one's the one he showed me.
Ah, okay,
That's
there
the
we go.
one, yeah.
I pressed the wrong button. I'm sorry. This world was shaped by thousands of years of trade, travel, and intercultural contact between the far shores of the Gulf and the wider Indian Ocean. It was reinforced by centuries of political control of Iran over Arab lands, of Arabs over Iranian ports, and of Indian-based empires over large parts of Arabia. For the Gulf's Arab inhabitants, their world was Bombay, not Beirut, Calicut, like here, and Karachi, not Cairo. After the dawn of the oil era, that world slowly faded away in the wake of nationalist movements seeking to downplay or erase the foreign elements in their respective nationalist cultures. This change is best symbolized by the name game, the dispute over the Gulf's very identity, Persian or Arab. My paper examines the origins, significance, and consequences of the Arab Gulf, a term first proposed by Arab nationalist intellectuals in Iraq and Egypt in the 1930s, and gradually adopted in the GCC states in the 1950s to 70s. The Arab Gulf movement was part of a wider Arabization process in the GCC states. That's odd. Sorry. A wider, sorry, I lost my place. Read over again. The Arab Gulf movement was part of a wider Arabization process in the GCC states that reorientated their Arab populations away from the Indian Ocean towards the Arab world. Arab nationalism has problematized and politicized these states' transnational heritage with serious implications for their non-Arab denizens. My paper's got 4 parts, so I'll talk a bit about each one of these, and depending on how I'm doing for time, I might just start reading off script to cover the main points. First of all, the transnational Gulf. Until the 1950s, the most commonly used names for the region were Al-Khalij al-Farsi, Khaliji Fars, Persian Gulf. The names Khalij al-Arabi, Arab Gulf, Arabian Gulf did not emerge in popular usage in the Gulf itself by GCC citizens until the 1950s and 60s. Thus, anyone researching the pre-oil Gulf will find no records listed under these terms. One must use Persian Gulf, as Eastern Arabia's most famous historian, Sheikh Dr. Sultan al-Ghassemi, the ruler of Sharjah, explains in his PhD thesis from Durham University. Quote, most of the documents used in this study call the Gulf the Persian Gulf, and sometimes refer to the Red Sea as the Arabian Gulf. It becomes necessary to use the term Persian Gulf henceforward to avoid confusion. Indeed, as Sheikh Sultan shows, Arabian Gulf was the old name for the Red Sea, not the Gulf itself. Nonetheless, the region's historical name is misleading, for its principal inhabitants came not from one, but 5 cultural groups: Persians, Arabs, Indians, Baluchis, and Africans. While most lived predominantly within their respective cultural communities, many lived along a transnational spectrum somewhere in between, possessing a hybrid culture that was part Persian, part Arab, part Indian, part Baluchi, and/or part African, the precise mixture of which varied from port to port and person to person over time. The denizens of this transnational world were known as Khalijis in Arabia and Bandaris in Iran. They were multilingual, while their own languages were influenced by others, just like their cuisine, customs, and material culture. The origins of this multiculturalism and transnationalism were largely geologistical. Before the days of flight, sailing from one side of the Gulf to the other was easier and faster than traveling overland to the interior, and sailing from the Gulf to India or Africa was easier and faster than traveling to the Mediterranean Middle East. In the absence of clear and controlled borders, this movement became fluid and pervasive. This was one of the main reasons why Eastern Arabia had a stronger economic and social tie to Iran, India, and Africa than to the rest of the Arab world before oil. In his classic preface to history, Carl Gustafsson explains a fundamental principle of history, that while historians must necessarily view the past from the present, a person has not attained truly mature historical mindedness until he is able to see the present from the various vantage points of the past. In the Gulf region, viewing the past from the perspective of the present is difficult indeed, for one is encouraged to do so through the lens of Arab and Iranian nationalism. This is especially the case in Eastern Arabia, where historical records and accounts of the region contrast sharply to the selective histories promoted by the GCC states. At best, these selective histories do not tell the whole story. At worst, they present a fictionalized version of events. Both types of histories are politically motivated, serving the modern-day interests of government. And in fact, most states are like this around the world. Brexit is the most recent example where Britain overwhelmingly, well not overwhelmingly, marginally, rejected its own transnational past, ignoring the fact that it's not some sort of a cultural whole. Monocultural whole. The historical records and accounts of the Gulf region before the 1950s describe a very different world from the Arabized and Persianized one we see today. Only by reading such pre-nationalistic accounts are we able to see the traces of the now forgotten transnational world that once existed in the Gulf. These traces are all around us, often hidden in plain sight, neglected or disguised by years of state-sponsored efforts to remake each country into an idealized image, more Arab or Persian than it really was, while ignoring or denying the foreign contributions to national culture and history. This selective past is well expressed by Michel Kanu, the deputy chairman of the Kanu Group in the UAE. He writes, quote, In the Gulf, we are more a mixing pot than a melting pot, since each racial identity still keeps true to itself, even after years of interacting together. We still retain our own identity, which makes us unique. While I'm likely to know Hindi or Farsi and enjoy the foods and customs and celebrations of these people, I am still an Arab of the Gulf, and that will always be true of me. While some of the Gulf's inhabitants certainly coexisted in culturally autonomous worlds, most did not. The Gulf was in fact more a melting pot than a mixing pot. The result was a mélange of cultural influences that were not purely Arab or Persian, making the name the Gulf, Persian or Arab, inadequate, no matter the name. But before the rise of Arab nationalism in the 1950s, both the name of the Gulf and its ethnographic diversity were not politically problematic. One's ethnicity or culture mattered less, far less, than it does today. The confusion over the name of the Gulf, Persian or Arab, dates back to the 1930s when Arab nationalist intellectuals in Cairo and Baghdad, writing in newspapers, first called for the Persian Gulf to be renamed the Arab Gulf. This is very interesting. There's a clear debate of a rename campaign that's being launched. They argue that Persian Gulf was a fossilized name from antiquity, when the region as a whole was under Persian control, that it was no longer Persia's Gulf, that the populations on both shores of the Gulf had been predominantly Arab for centuries, that many Iranian ports, such as Mohammed, now Khorramshahr, Bushehr, Linga, Bandar Abbas, had been governed by autonomous Arab rulers since the 18th century, until they were ousted by Tehran between 1850 and 1925. That even when Bahrain was under Iranian rule in the 16 and 1700s, it was ruled by Arabs from Iran, and that the majority of countries bordering the Gulf today are Arab, and that the region's dominant culture has been Arab for centuries. However, it was not until the arrival of Arab nationalism in the 1950s that the term Arab Gulf first began to be used in the Gulf itself. Now, in this section, I talk about the chronology, the historical chronology of the movement to start adopting the use of the term Arab Gulf and how it came about. And I don't think I have time to go into all the details, so I'll give you the overview. Basically,
you have 4 minutes.
4 minutes, okay. So basically what happened was a combination or a constellation of different factors that resulted in the popularization of the term Arab Gulf. The debate, the discourse to adopt the term Arab Gulf had been, up until this point, largely outside of the Gulf itself. But with the arrival of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the launch of the Voice of the Arabs radio, the establishment of the Egyptian Cultural Mission, first in Kuwait and then later on in other countries like Qatar, and the promotion of Egyptian and Arab popular culture, the circulation of Arab films and literature, and most importantly, the increasing numbers of Arab teachers from Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and Palestine teaching in the newly emerging state-sponsored schools in the GCC states. The result was the cultural sort of reorientation of the youth of the 1950s, those who were in their 20s and teens and 20s at that time. They were the first ones to really be brought up in the Arab world culturally. And they were made to realize that they were part of this larger entity. So a cultural gap then grew between them and their parents, who continued to use the term Persian Gulf. And we can see this by looking at the government letterheads, for example, of all the different governments, government of Qatar, government of Dubai. Persian Gulf continued to be used up until the 60s and 70s. But it's when these, the youth of the 1950s began to themselves start working for government and moving up into positions of power and authority, that the term began to be used more thoroughly. The first government to make the term Arab Gulf the legal name for the region and to ban the use of Persian Gulf was Iraq. After the 1958 coup that brought Karim Abdel Qasim to power. And following this, through the 1960s, then increasing numbers of Arab majority states in the Arab world began to use the term. and the term slowly began to fall out of use, such that by the early 1960s, it became almost impossible to post a letter, say to Kuwait or Bahrain, entitled Persian Gulf. It would be returned or destroyed. And the same would go for Iran. If you wrote Arabian Gulf, the letter would be returned or destroyed. Now, the name was actually just the beginning of a much larger,
I'm giving you 2 more minutes.
oh, thank you, Arabization process. Because at the same time that this was going on, the Gulf states were beginning to develop institutionally, develop national symbols, national constitutions, in which they began to identify themselves, not in relation to their historical cosmopolitan past, but in relation to the Arab world. And they began to put into their definitions of themselves that they are part of the Arab world. And it's from this point on that their Arab identity began to be strongly asserted. But the interesting thing is that today we think that this is how things always were, when in reality this only goes back a few generations. This is a relatively recent thing. Now, the knock-on effect for this has significant implications for non-Arab residents, long-term residents of the GCC states who've been here for generations, who, while not claiming Arab ancestry, nonetheless have been a part of the country going back hundreds of years. The best example of this would be Oman, where there is a virtual sort of indigenous Indian population there, the oldest elements of which enjoy Omani citizenship. But nonetheless, this was a problem in the process of state formation, because on the one hand, you have a monocultural identity that is being sort of introduced, but stands nonetheless one that stands in contrast to the historical reality of these states. So my paper looks at all the different dynamics of this, and the law of unintended consequences comes into play. In reality, the states have an official discourse, and then there's the reality under the surface in which these non-Arab elements can nonetheless be accommodated into the state through other different ways and means.
Conclude?
Okay. So to conclude, the Arabization of the GCC states has been so effective that today no one is in any doubt at all that you are, when you're in a GCC state, that you are in the Arab world. And this despite the fact that in many of the GCC states, the Arab citizens are in fact a minority in a sea of expats. And that concludes my paper. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Well, first of all, I have some thanks to extend to a whole lot of people, some of whom are here, some of whom are not. Firstly, since you are here, Amira, thank you very much for your support.
No, thank you.
For the conference as chair of faculty, and also for being kind enough to come and chair this one.
Pleasure.
We're very grateful to you.
Pleasure.
Thanks. And then a number of other people, QNRF for helping to fund the conference, played an absolutely essential role in that regard. Our dean, James Reardon Anderson, who I think is not here at the moment, but anyway, thanks to him, both for his support and also for coming in and chairing. And to all the people who have organized the conference, our events people, for sparing Harry and me, so much work, and also for laying on some excellent food, I have to say. As a former journalist, I stick to the immortal military principle: first secure your food supply. To communications for advertising, for publicizing it throughout Qatar, thank you. And finally to Hagar Raka for her indispensable work of organizing and arranging things. Thank you so much. One thing is absolutely certain: I couldn't have done it myself. Harry might have, I couldn't have. And, well, thanks to you all for coming. We are extremely grateful. And thank you for having made this, this conference, I think, so extremely intellectually interesting. Now, a few not very well-connected thoughts on the basis of what we've heard in the past couple of days. And please forgive me if I leave some people out. It's just I'm trying to tie things together into my own head. One thing which came up very strongly in the keynote address by Professor Blum-Hansen at the start and recurred on occasions afterwards was the power of tradition sometimes for good and ill, good or ill. I was immensely struck by the portrait of the Menons, a community I thought I knew quite well, but I learned much more from your talk. As, by the way, I learned so many more things from so many of the talks in this conference, which I hadn't known before, including, I have to say, on areas of the world that I thought I did know quite a lot about. But the way in which this immensely strong Menon tradition has adapted itself with tremendous success to the commercial world of the Indian Ocean put in place, well, not created, of course, by any means completely by the British Empire, but certainly vastly extended and developed in new ways by the British Empire, was extremely striking. And I think one can see certain parallels there with Singapore, with some of the things we heard about Singapore as well. And this strangely Janus-faced aspect of tradition, which of course depends on what the traditions are, that strong traditions can be a force for blind conservatism and a retreat into defensive paranoia, but sometimes the strength of a tradition can also give the confidence and the solidarity to enable people to adapt very successfully to change. The second thing connected to that in a way, which I thought also came up from the Singapore story, but some other things as well, is the importance of some sort of collective idea or story, if not in the population at large, at the very least in enough of the leadership, and an effective story which can appeal to, convince, enough of the population at large. And then the question, and once again, if one has a sufficiently strong idea of that kind, the remarkable intellectual gymnastics that one can perform on this foundation. I love this business of Lee Kuan Yew, this we heard not actually Chinese reading, English-trained lawyer, reinventing himself as a neo-Confucian in his 40s, but actually being able to sell this idea rather convincingly. Now, in connection with what Islam Hassan and James Onley said about the Gulf, I was repeatedly, during the last 2 days, reminded of Ernest Renan's famous dictum about modern nationalism, that to become a nation, a people must have many things in common, but they must also have forgotten many things. This deliberate act of forgetting. Both of the talks on the Gulf itself were all about that. It did raise the somewhat, well, I will omit the adjective, but anyway, the thought about whether in order to create some nations, it's actually necessary to forget not some things, but almost everything. And whether that can, in fact, be a solid basis for a national idea or national identity. This, by the way, links up to a central debate, a somewhat, it must be said, repetitive and hackneyed one by now, between what have been called, not altogether fairly, the constructivists and the primordialists in the study of nationalism and its origins. In other words, how far is it possible completely to construct a modern nation from a new idea or a new elite? And how far do you have to have some kind of strong, previously existing identity or tradition to build on? I was thinking about this also in the context of the last panel, when it comes to the dynamics of state building, whether there is here possibly a kind of inescapable, almost tragic dilemma that countries face between, on the one hand, the needs of state creation, and amongst other things, I mean, since we're all intellectuals here, the fictionalization of history, but still more, of course, question which came up in the context of what Narendra Modi is trying to do in India now, but what has been done so often in modern history. The fact that if you have a nation state, you need a sovereign people as a basis. And what does it take to create that sovereign people? And how many other people have to be eliminated in the process? Either intellectually and culturally, as we've heard in the Gulf, or of course very often physically in the process of creating nations. As I say, this tragic dilemma between what has so often happened in this regard, and by the way, listening to Professor Onley talking about the Britain's Brexit vote and how this ignored the multinational, multicultural history of Britain. Yes, indeed, this is fictional. But of course, this is a fiction which in some ways has been in the process of creation, recreation for almost 500 years. This idea of well, first England and then Britain. I mean, the idea of Britain as a nation, which of course it never wholly became. That's why we're now facing Scottish independence. But very much this idea of Britain as a Protestant nation, breaking from its Catholic past and absolutely explicitly excluding its remaining Catholic inhabitants in Ireland and Scotland, excluding once again culturally, legally, and pretty often physically as well, either through death or forced emigration. Now, in Britain, then there was a move away from that, starting with the acceptance of the Catholics in the 19th century. But it left a legacy, of course, of British or English separation from the continent, which on the one hand, yes, is fictional, but of course if you work on a fiction for 500 years, it has a way of becoming a fact in its own right. And that is, of course, precisely what nationalisms try to do. They try to turn fictions into fact through incessant, grim repetition, above all through the school system, something which is, of course, deeply distressing to a historian to witness, unless, of course, the historian in question is actually employed by the state to do just that, as is so often the case, of course, in so many countries in Europe in the past, and in South Asia and other places today. A very large intellectual effort on the part of the Indian state, and as not only, it must be said, under the BJP government, has gone precisely to producing fictional history in order to create this idea of an Indian people throughout history. And it does raise the question of whether this is something that states have to do. Because, of course, one of the reasons why states do this, feel they have to do it, and this is where the tragic element perhaps is involved, is that in so many parts of the world, including in Europe in the past, people who run states have a picture in their heads, not unlike the map that Will Reno showed us of southern Sudan, of complete disintegration into separate grouplets, which has been, of course, a reality in many countries with catastrophic results. In that context, an aside of my own, but in response to something that Will said about al-Shabaab in Somalia, having had essentially a local state-building aspect of its own, which has been ignored because of the continual prism of the war on terror. That is very close to a perception of my own about the Afghan Taliban, by the way, which was a state-building force, and in its own way, and in Afghan terms, a very formidable state-building force. But of course, was viewed completely in the West through Western prisms, rightly or wrongly, in ways which ignored the Afghan context in which they'd come to power, and then after 9/11, of course, was viewed completely, through the prism of the war on terror. But since so much of the conference has been devoted to looking at state building through all these different prisms, in all these local contexts, it's quite interesting in this regard, and in terms of the contrast, between al-Shabaab and some of the other forces in Somali society, or the picture given of southern Sudan, the contrast between the Afghan Taliban, which, as I say, was in its own way a strong state-building force. A strong state-building force, of course, with a certain inheritance, though they might not have admitted it themselves, of previous generations of Afghan state building. But the contrast between the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban, which, God forbid that I should give vent to any kind of prejudices, even ones which the audience might find sympathetic, were basically a bunch of brigand savages, under a multiplicity of different, local chieftains. On that score, and perhaps finally, of course, another theme of the conference was the international context of all this, the geopolitics, and the question of China's role, not only in the pure geopolitical sense, but also the question of the Chinese model. Oh, by the way, I heard one really shocking thing in the course of the conference, though it was at dinner last night, which is why these final remarks have been a little bit grim, and I had to introduce the word tragedy, because Rana Mitter suggested that I might be being too optimistic about geopolitics. I can't remember when I was last accused of being optimistic about something, so I felt I needed to introduce a very, very strong corrective to that. So, perhaps the thought came up that I think most people were agreed that there is no Chinese model. China in that sense is neither side in the Cold War. Neither the Soviet Union with its plan for socialist modernity, but nor the USA either with its plan for a pretty, strong ideological idea of what a state should look like, even if, of course, the United States, like the Soviet Union, betrayed its own principles in practice continuously. But the idea that, rather than some model, there may be a set of, shall we say, norms and modes of procedure held by Beijing, but which may also be compatible with new thinking on the part of the West, the USA, especially after the rather evident failure of attempts by the USA and its allies in Iraq, Afghanistan, and indirectly in Libya. And this perhaps focuses on the need for effective states in whatever form and however defined. Effective states as necessary for the working of the world economy, but also, of course, for the control, suppression of disruptive elements of various kinds. And I was struck in that context by Will Reno's account of the reasons and or explanations for Ethiopian intervention in Somalia, because these have great echoes in imperial history, both British and Russian, an imperial history extending deep into our own time and closely linked, of course, with the wider war on terror. When Russia intervened for the second time in Chechnya in 1999, the explanation was not only in terms of terrorism emanating from Chechnya, but also banditry, that the Chechen government had essentially completely lost control of its own society in ways which were making that society a danger, an acute danger to its neighbors, starting with Russia. Now, of course, as in the history of so many empires, this ignored the fact that it was many of the previous actions of Russia which had created this collapse, this inability to form an effective state. Because, of course, as one saw throughout the history of the 19th century empires, their expansion had such a disruptive effect on states beyond their borders that they collapsed, and their collapse then became a reason and or excuse for the further expansion of the empire. But probably it would also not be fair completely to ignore the real element here. Russia was in fact subjected to appalling levels of banditry and kidnapping as well as terrorism in the late 1990s. In the later 19th century, this was given classic form by the Russian foreign minister, Prince Gorshakov, when explaining to Britain why Russia had to expand into Central Asia, because the Central Asian states, were simply havens of raiding and banditry. This was, of course, simply an excuse for Russian imperial expansion. On the other hand, it must be said that Russia had, in fact, been raided by these people for many centuries. Slave raiding continued into the early 19th century. Gorshakov was, of course, also in that simply in a polite and diplomatic way, trying to talk to the British about pots and kettles. Because the British, once again, had repeatedly used this as an excuse for further imperial expansion. And Afghanistan here is an interesting case, because the British, of course, twice tried to deal with what they saw as the Afghan problem by the imposition of direct British control on the ground and military occupation. Those both turned into extremely expensive military disasters, even though, the British won in the end, but it was such a Pyrrhic victory, it obviously couldn't be continued. After the Second Afghan War, the British adopted a strategy which is precisely what Putin adopted in Chechnya after the reconquest of Chechnya after 1999, which was to identify a local strongman and build him up indirectly with guns and money. The Afghans don't like to remember it, but the modern Afghan state is largely a product of British subsidies in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, as the Russians have done with the Kadyrov dynasty in Chechnya since 2002. And so this raises in my mind, the question of whether not, the idea of the US and China and India, for that matter, working together as the world's policemen, but a sort of rough, and I mean rough in every sense of the word, consensus on, as we heard, intervention okay to support states in Africa, even perhaps to rebuild states, but not, for the whole responsibility to protect, let alone to intervene directly in order to break up states. Finally, to come back to this part of the world, of course, the British intervention in the Gulf of Basra. Can we agree on that? I can't remember all the other titles. Gulf of, oh no, since we're in Qatar, we can't call it the Gulf of Bahrain, God forbid. Possibly even worse than the Persian Gulf. Anyway, the British intervention in this part of the world in the 19th century was, of course, initially very largely to suppress piracy, local piracy, and also in the process to suppress the local conflicts which produced piracy. As I'm sure you will remember, the old name for UAE was the Truce al Oman, because the British imposed a truce on the local sheikdoms, because they saw that the wars between them were also generating wider problems, above all in terms of piracy, which was affecting British commercial interests in the region, which will never do. We can't possibly have that. And in the process, of course, the British also committed themselves to building up some of the sheikhs. Some of them they eliminated, but building up local sheikdoms as bulwarks of the local British hegemony and British order in the region. And, well, since we are where we are, I suppose we could say that it hasn't worked too badly. Thank you all very much.